recording videos like this is quite hard, mostly because my brain kind of interprets and thinks things through more of like a visual lens, through pictures and feelings and stuff like that. So whenever it comes to putting it into words and stuff, it's kind of difficult. Of course, that is a challenge of writers. I get that I need to work on that. That's probably why it's taken me so long to make this video. Also, my younger sisters are almost always singing in the background. I just had to pause because one of them was running through singing like some Rapunzel song. Okay, let's just get right into this. The reason I'm making this video is just because usually videos that teach you about characters will go like either way, like two extremes. Either one, they'll be super like showing you graphs and all these things you should probably go through, and those could be helpful, but they never really helped me out personally. And then there's the other side, which is just super vague, and they're just like, oh, just put more effort into it. Just make sure to think more. Like, okay, think about what? So hopefully this is going to be a good middle ground that isn't too graphs everywhere, but also isn't too, like, vague. Alright, the internet is full of useless information. I am just going to tell you basically what I come up with. So instead of, like, using INFJ or INBT or whatever frickin' heckin' CB2B8, usually I will just come up with a core value that the character might have, or, like, say maybe there's something they're, like, insecure about, but, like, I don't know, like some sort of core belief or like a core issue that will then affect literally everything else they do. So something like they need validation, or they hate something about themselves, like they hate just like something that's hard to explain. And then everything else will kind of branch off of that. I'm not really talking about this as well as I initially wanted to, but the website I was trying to find just cannot be found because the internet is absolutely saturated with useless information. But yeah, a long time ago, basically, I made a video talking about how to create characters super easily, taking one core thing about yourself, the one that you like about yourself, and something you don't like about yourself, and combining them to kind of make, you know, the very basic components of your character. So you can do that as well here. And then this will be considered basically the core of your character that everything else will branch off of. Alright, after figuring out what the core issue of your character is, there are three things that will branch directly off of it, one being plot relevance, one will be on-screen presence, and the third one being personal story. Putting them simply, personal story is basically the kind of information you would give in a backstory, you know, flashbacks and stuff like that. It's the story that follows the character from their very birth to their very end, and whether or not it's connected to the actual plot isn't necessary, it's just their story as a whole. Then on-screen presence is basically how they present themselves, which can be very complicated, as you might imagine, and it's also, of course, affected by the other two. And then plot relevance is, you know, how they interact with the plot, where they arrive, what their importance is to it, all these other kind of factors as well. And I've separated these three, but really in my brain I don't think of them too separately because they are so tightly connected, and it's kind of important to think of them that way because you can't just develop one without developing the others. All of them need to be developed at the same time and be given about the same level of importance. So yeah. And then all the things branching off are really loose concepts. I honestly didn't put too much thought into them because, again, that's one of the vague things. It's kind of hard to put to words. But for personal story, I just went ahead and put placement and character interactions because they are closely tied to that. And the little line on the side is basically connecting it to world building. So in case you're curious about that, that's what that means. And then for on-screen presence, there's character interactions because it's closely related to personal story. And then there's also personality and self-perception, which is connected to the plot relevance. And then there's also, for plot relevance, there's also goals and worth, and then the worth is connected to more like other characters and personal stuff like that. So it's not just connected to plot relevance or even just the core issue of the character, but rather is more affected by the world and the other characters around them, which is why there's a little line going off screen. The main point I even made this chart because this isn't something I like visually refer to at all whenever I'm creating characters. This is just the closest I could get to physically representing what's going on in my brain, is that you have all these things branching off of the core issue, so that way whenever people like put extra thought into it and kind of think about the characters, like a well-rounded character will always have everything leading back to the core issue. That's usually how you can tell what is a well-written character and what isn't, is if you look at all these traits, all their dialogue, everything they say, everything they do, and then you kind of relay them, think about them basically, and all those things trace back to their core issue. That's kind of how you can tell that they're a well-written character. Because the main thing you're going for when you're character writing is you're trying to create a complex character, not a complicated character. I'll also note I'm usually thinking of the character in two separate ways. There's the setup for a character and there's also the execution for a character. The setup is usually what I'm doing in like prep work when I'm just thinking about the character, and it's almost seen completely separate from the execution of the character actually existing in the story. Setup is more like you're still planning the character out and you need to think of things like what they would do if they were trapped in a room all by themselves, or what they would do if they were given some random toy or a phone or something like that, just random things that are not connected to the plot in any way, so that way you can kind of flesh them out a little bit more and think about what they might do or what they could do in other situations that you might not even find them in the plot. That's usually what I'm doing in the setup, and that is separate from the execution, which is putting them exclusively within the confines of the story and the other characters and kind of pushing them to their limits in that way. With all that in mind, let's just go through what we already have and see how it all connects together to the more like what you would actually see on screen and the more kind of tips that I guess you could more commonly find in other videos. Let's start with personality since it's the most vague one. Usually you can just look something up randomly on the internet, I guess, if you want to find some random personality. I usually think of a friend or a part of myself or something like that and put them into the character, but if you're not sure exactly where to go, you can easily just look up some IMBT or whatever personality type and just kind of go from there. But it's important that while you're coming up with the personality, you need to think of what would go best with the core issue or what would most likely occur or how someone would develop with the core issue in mind. So just make sure to think about that. Character interactions is honestly super important. It's probably what I put most of my effort into whenever I'm writing because it's something that can convey how the character thinks about other people, how the character thinks about themselves, how like all these different kinds of things. It's kind of how you segue to important story development or even like character development, all these kinds of things. So it's really important. And yeah, I'll probably have to make a whole separate video talking about all these different character dialogue things because it really is a complicated issue and I'm not sure if I can cover that in one video alone or in this video specifically. But I guess just essentially make sure that whenever the character is speaking, everything they say, every line of dialogue and every single thing is something that branches off from their core issue, that it's something that you can kind of get little hints of it. Otherwise, you're not going to have a very compelling and, not a very, easy to follow character. Placement is a rather vague word I use just to make sense of like all these different things that could happen, either what their magic system is, like where they are in the world, like what kind of family they're from. It's just kind of to cover all of that, just because all of that, should make it an impact on the character. And it's very important to definitely think about all that stuff and think about how that could affect the character. Otherwise, you're not gonna have a character that makes too much sense. Something I couldn't really draw a line to on the graph without making it look ugly was directly connecting self-perception to placement, because that is often, how our brains work. Where you grow up is usually how your brain functions and how it kind of programs itself. And if that isn't the case for your character, like if they grew up in a really poor area, but they act like they're super rich, then you should definitely highlight that and show how important that is, or even show how the character came to, be that way, because contradictions aren't bad for a character. If anything, I would encourage contradictions in your character, because it makes them more interesting. It makes people look at them and go, oh wow, I wonder how they ended up that way. That being said, no matter what the contradictions are, you still want them to make sense, because people are going to be turning to look at your character going, oh wow, wonder how they ended up that way, and if you don't have an answer for how they ended up that way, given their situation, then it's not going to be very satisfactory. I think goal, people usually put the goal way lower on this graph or something, to where the goal is the most important thing, but honestly, you're not born with a goal. You're not born thinking, oh, I need to save my sister, or oh, I need to help the lowest class earn money or something like that, or oh, I need to save the world from annihilation. You're going to exist and have a life and then just slowly develop a goal. I guess what I mean to say is a character should have two goals, technically speaking. There should be the goal that comes from their core issue. You know, if they have the desire to be loved, then their goal technically is to be loved. So that's gonna, move every single thing about them. And then the goal, the goal related to the plot is going to be tied directly to the desire to be loved. Say they want to save the princess. Well, obviously, if you think about it, they're going to be wanting to save the princess because they want to be loved by the princess or whoever they're trying to save her for, so that they can be impressed and be like, oh wow, he did save that princess. He must be cool. And, so that's what, it's kind of how that works. And then finally is worth. It's just a word I put in there. I felt like it worked. Again, it's something that is connected to all three of them, but it's kind of hard to put it into a chart and make it look all nice, so I just put it over next to plot relevance because technically it's closest related to the plot, because usually the sense of worth will change throughout the plot and all that stuff. So, yeah, it's basically just connected to their placement and their self-perception, and is just something that is constantly changing and flowing and whatever with the rest of the character. Again, it's important for their worth to be closely tied to their core issue. So if their core issue is, again, for example, to be loved, then they connect to the plot. They would have to, throughout time, face their core issue and kind of decide whether or not it's something that is important to them, or if it's something that needs to change, or like how to cope with that core issue. And that's what we call character development. I'm gonna go ahead and end the video there. I have so many more things I want to say, but honestly, my brain is just blanking whenever I come to actually trying to record it. Like, I just cannot think about it anymore. Maybe I'll have to write this all down. I'm just kind of ad-libbing right now, so I have no idea what I'm actually saying. But yeah, so if you liked that, cool. If not, then cool. I will try to make a better and longer and more thought out video. Haha, see you later. I'm saluting you right now. You can't see it, but I'm saluting you. But bye-bye. I love how I've been a YouTuber for like almost 10 years and I still act like every single video is my first video. What is wrong with me?